So, Prince Edward just evicted Queen Camilla from Windsor Lodge at midnight, and the part that nobody can explain is why the quietest member of the royal family suddenly decided to detonate a legal bomb under his own brother's marriage. Like, this is the guy who spent decades being called the most boring royal, the one who never causes problems, the one who shows up to events in sensible shoes and goes home. And now he's apparently the one who found the secret wartime loophole from the 1940s and used it to lock Camilla out of a house she'd been using as a private sanctuary for years. That timeline alone should make everyone pause. Before we get into the weeds, if you're into royal deep dives that actually explain the legal side of these messes, subscribe to my channel. We break down the stuff the palace press office won't touch. So, here's what we know. At 11:45 at night, a black sedan leaves Bagshot Park, which is Prince Edward's home, and drives toward Windsor Great Park. Inside is a courier carrying a manila envelope with the Duke of Edinburgh's official seal. Not a meeting request, not a family letter, not a polite note asking Camilla to maybe reconsider her weekend plans. It's an eviction notice, a legally binding one. And the palace staff on duty see the signature and immediately start calling up the chain. Because nobody saw this coming, Edward had deliberately picked a moment when King Charles was away from London, resting at Sandringham during a block of medical treatment. That's not an accident. That's someone who knew exactly when the king would be unreachable and exactly how long he'd have to move before anyone could push back. The notice gave Camilla's staff 72 hours to clear her personal belongings at a Windsor lodge. Not a negotiation window, a deadline. And the reason Edward could even do this is genuinely wild because on paper, the monarch controls crowned lands. Charles is the one who decides who lives where, but Edward's legal team had spent months digging through private archives at Windsor, and they found something from the reign of King George V, VI. During the 1940s, the family restructured how certain smaller estates within the Windsor boundaries were managed. They created private trusts to shield specific properties from government oversight and to protect the younger lines of the family. And buried in those documents was a covenant that gave the line of the youngest son a permanent hereditary veto over Windsor Lodge. That's the kind of detail that sounds fake until you remember that royal property law is basically 1,000 years of exceptions stacked on top of exceptions. Charles's lawyers completely missed this clause during recent estate audits. Edward found it, verified it with constitutional experts, and then used it to serve Camilla with papers that were legally airtight. And here's where it gets even stranger. The notice didn't just say Camilla had to leave. It said the property was being transferred immediately to Edward's daughter, Lady Louise Windsor, a 22-year-old university student who was technically a non-working royal. So now you have a prime, highly secure Windsor estate being handed to someone who isn't part of the official working machine, which openly defies Charles's entire slimmed-down monarchy plan. And the moving trucks were already scheduled to arrive at dawn. The whole thing was executed before anyone could breathe. Now let's talk about what happened when Camilla actually showed up. 2 unmarked moving vans pull up to the security barriers at 6 o'clock in the morning, headlights cutting through the mist, royal protection officers standing by the gatehouse. Then a gray SUV arrives from the opposite direction, and Camilla is in the front passenger seat wearing dark sunglasses even though the sun is barely up. She rolls down her window and calls out to the head of estate security. And the gates don't open. Normally, the Queen's vehicle passes through any royal checkpoint without delay, but this guard is holding a clipboard and refusing to press the release button. His orders came directly from Prince Edward's private estate office, and they were absolute. No unauthorized vehicles, including the Queen's, were allowed inside until the property inventory was complete. So Camilla steps out onto the gravel flanked by her private secretary and demands to see the written authorization. The guard hands over a copy of the wartime covenant signed by King George V, VI, stamped with a seal that hasn't been used in over 70 years. The document says the youngest son's line holds absolute custody of this specific parcel during times of family transition. Camilla's secretary tries to call Buckingham Palace to get an override from the king's staff, Every call goes to voicemail. Charles was at Sandringham under strict medical orders to avoid stress, and his staff had been told to block all non-emergency communications. Edward timed the eviction to land during the one window when Camilla couldn't reach her husband. That's not just aggressive, that's surgical. So why would Edward risk a permanent rift with the king's wife over a country house? Windsor Lodge isn't the biggest property in the royal portfolio. It's a modest brick building surrounded by oak woodland. But for Camilla, it was the place where she kept her private family archives, personal journals, and gifts collected over decades. Items she didn't want mixed with official state collections. And when the packing crews finally got inside, they weren't moving standard furniture. They were tracking crates of personal papers and historical artifacts. Edward wasn't just reclaiming a house. He was securing specific items he believed belonged to the late Queen's legacy, not to Camilla's private estate. The destination addresses on the moving manifest didn't point to any major palace. The crates were split between a storage facility in Surrey and a small private cottage on the edge of the Windsor estate. Camilla wasn't being relocated to another royal residence. She was being stripped of her private base of operations inside the Windsor perimeter. And that means she'd be forced to rely entirely on official state-aid rooms, where every visitor and document is tracked by palace bureaucracy. That's a huge loss of autonomy for someone in her position. So the vans leave. Camilla drives back to London without making another statement, and the gates close. But within an hour, a green hatchback pulls up carrying Lady Louise Windsor. She steps out holding a leather duffel bag and a set of brass keys tied with a blue ribbon. She's wearing a wool coat and walking boots, looking like she's arriving for a term break, not taking possession of the most controversial house in Britain. Her father is waiting at the front door to hand over the title documents. And on the surface, it looks casual, but this is a massive departure from everything Edward and Sophie have said about their children's futures. Louise has spent years keeping a low profile, studying English literature at St. Andrews, rarely appearing at public engagements. Her parents famously said their kids would probably have to work for a living outside the royal firm. So why would she accept a property that ties her permanently to palace politics? The answer, according to what we're hearing, is that the lodge has extensive stabling facilities that were upgraded in 2002 for her late grandfather, Prince Philip. Louise is deeply involved in carriage driving, and this property gives her a training base without relying on the king's personal funding. So, it's not about luxury, it's about securing a specific sporting and family legacy. But the palace bureaucracy didn't take this lying down. An hour after Louise signed the property receipt, a courier from the Sovereign Grant Office arrived with a letter from the Treasury. Since the property had transferred to a non-working royal, all state-funded security patrols would cease at midnight. That's a direct punitive strike designed to make the house unlivable before she could even unpack. And Louise's response was apparently to walk out to the stables, inspect the perimeter fences herself, and then call a private security firm staffed entirely by retired royal protection officers. So, the younger generation isn't backing down. Meanwhile, back at Bagshot Park, Edward is sitting in his study with a leather-bound logbook of every property transfer within Windsor for the last 50 years. He picks up a secure phone line, and instead of calling Buckingham Palace, he calls Adelaide Cottage, Prince William's residence. That's the alliance nobody was talking about until now. Edward and William have apparently been coordinating for over 18 months. William is concerned about the long-term management of private papers and historic collections housed outside the main state archives. By supporting Edward's move to secure Windsor Lodge, William is protecting the interests of the younger generation and ensuring key properties remain within the immediate line of succession rather than being controlled by Camilla's allies. And this is where the logic actually holds together. William and Edward reportedly agreed during the Balmoral Summit in 2024 that traditional family lines needed physical footholds within the Windsor perimeter to guarantee long-term operational security. If certain properties were leased to commercial tenants or distant relatives, the security boundary around the castle could be compromised. So Edward's move wasn't just about one house, it was about establishing a precedent. By using the George V Sixth Covenant, Edward proved that the monarch doesn't hold absolute power over every corner of the family estate. That creates a protective shield around other properties occupied by working royals. It sends a message that any future attempts to displace senior royals will be met with legal resistance. But just as that seemed settled, Camilla's legal team filed a countersuit. They weren't fighting to get the house back. They were claiming ownership of the art collection hanging in the lodge's main gallery, rare watercolors and private family portraits that were never catalogued in the official royal collection. If Camilla's team could prove these were personal gifts rather than crown assets, they could force a public auction or demand millions in compensation. Edward's response was to pull out the original inventory lists from the late Queen's executives. The documentation showed that every painting in the gallery had been catalogued as a permanent fixture of the estate, legally inseparable from the building. He had the papers delivered to Camilla's lawyers before the court opened the next morning, so that counterattack was neutralized almost instantly. But the bigger problem was sitting at Sandringham. King Charles was in the library looking at morning newspapers with headlines about the eviction while his medical team told him to avoid stress. His doctors were warning that elevated stress could interfere with his treatments, but he couldn't ignore the fact that his brother and his wife are now in open legal warfare. Charles was caught between loyalty to Camilla and respect for constitutional law. His Privy Council advisors warned that trying to overturn the covenant to a royal decree could trigger a parliamentary debate about the limits of monarchical power over crown lands. And his own lawyers confirmed that Edward's legal framework was airtight. If Charles tried to force Louise out, Edward's team was prepared to take the matter to open court. That would expose decades of private family financial agreements to public scrutiny. And it gets worse. The covenant didn't just protect Windsor Lodge, it contained clauses about the distribution of historical assets and other properties. If Charles fought this, he risked triggering an automatic audit of multiple residences occupied by senior royals. That audit could reveal that other homes were operating under legally vulnerable agreements. Edward didn't just secure a house for his daughter, he built a legal minefield around the entire estate management system and dared the king to walk through it. Charles spent hours pacing the gardens at Sandringham, looking at old photographs of King George V/6, trying to understand the original intent of the 1940s trust agreements. Eventually, he realized that fighting a losing battle in public would damage the monarchy's reputation permanently. The public dealing with economic pressures would have no sympathy for royals arguing over multi-million-pound houses. So, Charles made his decision. He summoned his private secretary and ordered all legal counteractions from the Duchy of Lancaster office to stop. He signed an executive order confirming Lady Louise's residency at the lodge. The immediate legal standoff ended, but the scar inside his inner circle didn't heal. This surrender marked a massive shift in how the family operates behind closed doors. The traditional absolute authority of the monarch was quietly decentralizing. The younger lines of the family, with tactical support from Prince William, were carving out their own independent zones of security before the next reign could even begin. And that's the part that matters long term. By Friday morning, the moving vans were gone. A private security detail was patrolling the perimeter. Lady Louise was settled into the ground floor study where Camilla's private journals had been just days earlier. Her university textbooks and equestrian notebooks were on the shelves. The geography of the estate had been rewritten in a single week. Camilla stayed at Clarence House in London, focusing on official duties and refusing to schedule weekend breaks at Windsor. Her inner circle viewed the whole episode as a calculated corporate strike, time to exploit a moment of family vulnerability. The relationship between Camilla and Edward's branch of the family is now permanently fractured. Court insiders say seating arrangements for upcoming autumn events are being redrawn to keep the factions apart. Then Prince William made an unannounced visit to the property on Friday afternoon. He drove himself, took the back roads from Adelaide Cottage, and showed up with a housewarming gift for Louise. No press team, no official convoy. The message to the palace bureaucracy was clear. The future king approved of the new arrangement. That endorsement paralyzed any remaining plans for a counterstrike. The traditional court factions realized that challenging Louise's tenancy was futile. This is the dawn of a new administrative era where the younger generation doesn't wait for invitations or central assignments. They secure their own borders, manage their own assets, and protect the legacy of the late queen through precise legal means. The ripple effects hit the rest of the household staff quickly. New duty rosters appeared at estate notice boards. Local land agents who previously answered to central crown authorities were now routing paperwork through Bagshot Park. A significant portion of Windsor Parkland was operating outside immediate Buckingham Palace oversight. The institutional managers in London were scrambling to update their organizational charts, and the public reaction once details leaked actually favored Louise. Her reputation as a grounded, hard-working student worked in her favor. Commentators noted that her passion for carriage driving made her the perfect custodian for a property tied to Prince Philip's sporting life. The palace press office, unable to reverse the situation, quietly allowed this positive framing to take hold. That neutralized whatever leverage Camilla's allies had left. By the weekend, the lodge had transformed from a hidden archive for the Queen's private collections into an active independent outpost for a rising branch of the family. The alliance between Edward and William created a protective shield that even the highest offices of the crown couldn't penetrate. The centralized authority that governed Windsor properties for generations was broken by an old wartime covenant and a family determined to claim their space. The woods around the lodge went quiet again, but the institutional balance of the House of Windsor had changed permanently. So, when you look at the whole picture, this wasn't really about a house. It was about who controls the physical and historical assets of the family moving forward. Edward found a legal tool that had been sitting in archives for decades, and he used it at the exact moment when Charles couldn't fight back and William wouldn't stop him. Camilla lost a private sanctuary, but more importantly, she lost the unspoken assumption that she could operate within the Windsor perimeter on her own terms. Louise gained the property, but she also gained a permanent role in the family's internal power structure, whether she wanted it or not. And Charles, sitting at Sandringham with his medical team hovering, made the calculation that preserving the crown's public image mattered more than defending his wife's private dignity. That's a cold choice, and it tells you everything about where the monarchy is heading. The old rules, where the sovereign's word was final, are eroding. The younger branches are building their own power bases, and the man who was supposed to be the most boring royal just proved he's the one who knows how to win. What happens next, it wins.